from my side. I'm Jutta Rosen. I'm the president of the EAAE and a professor at the Technical University of Munich. It is a great pleasure for me and the board of the EAAE to open this sixth webinar in our new format for activities within our association, a webinar on policy recommendations to enhance resilience of European farming systems. I think a very important topic that reaches a lot of our attention in better understanding how farming systems are actually working. I will leave the floor actually to the presenters and the organizers of this webinar to introduce the topic more in detail, and also the presenters. I just like to, well, give you a few updates from our work in the board of the EAAE. As you have noticed, we have decided together with the local organizing committee and the program committee that the Prague Congress in July will be held online. And unfortunately, the development of the pandemic is so at this point in time that we are probably right that we do so. We are working closely together to make a good online format, and soon the registration for the Congress will be open, and we of course hope that many people participate in the Congress. Other things the board has been working on is that we are developing a professional code of conduct, which we think is very important for a scientific organization, and we are also developing a PhD network platform where we want to join forces across Europe for offering potential PhD courses to our young researchers. I also like to point to you that on our website, you see that a few activities are taking up now again. So there are two more seminars going on before the Congress in springtime. And we are also starting to receive proposals for new seminars, EAAE seminars in the fall and the coming year. So I encourage all our members, if you have great ideas for seminars in webinar form or maybe later in presence, we always welcome these kind of initiatives. And I leave it at that, and I'm happy to hand over to Alberto, who will then introduce this webinar.
Thank you, Jutta. Thank you, Madam President. It's a pleasure to introduce this seminar that is organized in the context of a European project that is finishing in the topic of farm systems resilience. The seminar is intended to cover policy-oriented contributions, and you will hear a lot about this, and we will make sure that all our messages, all our main contributions and findings are presented in a synthesized way so that you can hear more about what is essential as results of the project. This seminar is organized within the context of this project that the leading coordinator will present in a minute, and I'll introduce you to her. And the program is intended to also give a floor to a senior officer of the European Commission, and also a senior officer of the most important organization representing European farmers. And they will give us their views on these topics. And without further delay, I'll introduce you to Professor Miranda Mewison, who is the leading coordinator of our project. And she's a professor of risk management and food supply chains at Wageningen University and Research. As I said, she is the coordinator of the Sure Farm project, and she'll make a short introduction about our project. Miranda, please.
Thank you very much, Alberto. Yeah, so that gives me 5 minutes to introduce a 4-year project with all these partners and case study systems. So I thought, well, what to say about the project in these 5 minutes. So I selected 5 crucial points that characterize our project. So about 4 years ago, we started with this European-wide project on resilience and sustainability of farming systems. And 5 issues stand out in our project, I would say. The first one is quite an obvious one. This is a project about dealing with risks and challenges. And not only the obvious, maybe, challenge that you think about, so the extreme weather due to climate change, but also the softer problems of lack of labor, COVID. We didn't think about that earlier. So that is one of the central points. The second central point is that we are looking to the classical coping risk management strategies like insurance, but we also look at the room and the capacity for farming systems to adapt themselves and to transform as a response to challenges. Thirdly, what characterizes the Sure Farm project is that we have investigated the resilience questions very much in the local context, because everyone can imagine that the problems in Romania, for instance, with the small mixed farms are very different from those with the large scale farms in Bulgaria or in East Germany and Altmark. So we looked at that local context. The fourth point is that we use mixed methods. So you see evidence from quantitative analysis, for instance, stability of income, stability of environmental performance, but we also looked behind the front door of the farm families and of the cooperatives. So we try to understand, why is the income stable or not? So this mixed method is also characterizing our approach. And the fifth aspect that I would like to mention is that, so we had all these local and regional knowledge, but through using a very structured approach of every time we talk about the same capacities, the same resilience issues, the same resilience characteristics of systems, we also are able to come up with generic conclusions and policy recommendations. And that is exactly where we are at the moment. So we have policy briefs. Today we focus on 4 of them that try to see from all these local evidences, from the qualitative and quantitative methods, what stands out in the end? What can we recommend to policy, but also to business, for instance, about these challenges that the farming systems have to deal with? With that, I thought these are the characteristics of our project that we did for the past 4 years. And I take a small half minute to thank the Sure Farm colleagues who present today. Very nice that you want to do that. And I would like also to thank audience, because it's very nice to write policy briefs, but it's much better to talk about them. So that is an excellent opportunity today, also with the very good reflections that we get in the end, and your questions, I'm sure. And I would like to thank Barbara, because Barbara, you have taken the initiative for this and the organization. So thanks for that. With that, I give the floor back to Alberto.
Thank you very much, Miranda, for making this short introduction. And I think what is now interested and one of the main focuses of the project is to hear what we can say about our results, our main conclusions. So the first presenter is Barbara Soriano, who is an assistant professor of the Department of Agricultural Economics, Statistics and Business Management at Universidad Politécnica de Madrid, Technical University of Madrid, my university as well. And she's going to talk us about farmer behavior, farmer adapted behavior and risk management in European Union agriculture. Barbara will have 10 minutes and she'll make an effort to make her messages being conveyed in a most synthesized way so that you can learn more about our conclusions based on this. So Barbara, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Alberto. Miranda, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jutta, for your warm welcome. I'm going to present, as Alberto said, the policy brief on farmer adaptive behavior and risk management in European Union agriculture. This is a result of a big team that made a great effort. This big team and great team was led by Robert Finger. And I have the pleasure to present this policy brief. So thank you very much for this Work Package 2 team for this policy brief. Let me start my presentation by presenting some key points that we found in our research that are important to be in consideration when we want to improve risk management to make the farming system more resilient. The first point is that we found that farmers perceive a wide variety of challenges affecting the farms, as Miranda just said. We have to take into consideration that farmers are dealing not just with shock, but also against long-term pressures. We've conducted more than 1,000 farmer surveys in 11 case study regions across Europe. And as you can see in this figure, representing the challenges perceived by farmers across Europe, we can see that farmers are worried about, to a greater extent, about long-term pressures versus shocks in the short term. When we talk about these long-term pressures, we are talking about, for example, aging of farmers, increasing labor cost, public distrust toward agriculture, lowering meat consumption, for example, in case of livestock farming system. We also conducted, together with these surveys, we also conducted some narratives, biographical narratives in some of the case studies in order to know in more in depth the histories of farms. And researchers in these biographical narratives found that farmers are also worried about these different internal and external factors. But it's true that they also found that farmers found that internal factors are more prominent than external factors. These internal factors that farmers are worried about are, for example, the family breakdown, succession, or farmers' illnesses. If we go to the following point, we can see that it's true that there is a wide diversity of challenges, but there are also a wide diversity of strategies to deal with these challenges across Europe. And we want to highlight that it's important to take into consideration the risk-sharing strategies because they are also really relevant. And we want to point out the role of learning and cooperation. In this graph, you can also see this is a result, additional results from the surveys. That it's true that farm strategies are relevant and are the most implemented strategies, risk strategies implemented by farmers. But you can see that also risk management in the top of the column, they are also important. And they are important, those strategies refer to learning and cooperation between farmers. In order to learn more in depth about learning strategies and this cooperation, we also performed in-depth interviews regarding learning strategies conducted by farmers. In these in-depth interviews, we found that farmers implemented a lot of different learning strategies, such as, for example, learning from other farmers, learning new skills, seeking out information, experimentation. And we also address which was the networks, the influencing networks of the farmers. And we found that maybe mainly the individuals are those that are influencing the farmers, for example, family members and also consultants. It's true that also cooperatives and other kind of associations in which the farmers belong to, they are also relevant and they also impact on the decision making of farmers. And the last thing we found in these in-depth interviews is that it's true that, for example, the motivation, the beliefs of farmers are really important factors explaining the decision making of farmers. The third point I would like to highlight is that when we consider the risk management strategy, it's important to take into consideration that many actors are involved in the implementation of the risk management strategies. So we need to think beyond the farmer, and we need to think about the other actors that belong to the farming system. In this figure that has been published by Mewisen et al., in which Mewisen published the theoretical framework to assess resilience, we can see that, okay, farmers are in the central of the farming system, but there are also another actors really important that also are participating in risk management implementation, such as, for example, processors, technical providers, local government. And all of them play a role in implementing the strategies. So all of them are important to improve risk management strategies. And the last point is that we found that there are many opportunities for novel risk management approaches, and we try to do our best to take full advantages of this rapid technological progress. As you can see in this figure, for example, a work published by Bruegge, we can see there is a great potential of satellite imagery that can be used as input data from current existing insurance programs, such as indemnity insurance, airjet insurance, and weather index insurance. So these 4 points I just explained to you are the basis for our policy recommendations that I am going to present right now. So what we recommend as a result of our work in assessing risk management in the European Union is that policy shall support the diversity of risk management strategy across Europe. This diversity is really important to consider. Policies need to enable these long-term strategies to deal with these long-term pressures that are perceived by farmers. We need to strengthen learning and sharing of risk strategies. And we also need to pursue this holistic approach in which policies need to follow a multi-actor approach, considering going beyond the farmer. And the last one is that policies shall enable a wide and diversity set of innovative insurance solutions can be developed. For example, by providing access to this high-quality data of satellite imagery. This is all. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will be glad to answer your questions at the end of the presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for keeping the time. I was going to mention that this meeting is being recorded and that you have the chat line to write your questions, and we'll try to convey them to the speakers. Now, the next paper is going to be given by Professor Alphonse Ballmann, who is a full professor at Martin Luther University at Halle-Wittenberg and a researcher of the Sure Farm project. He's going to talk about future farm demographics and intergeneration renewal in European Union farming systems. So, Alphonse, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alberto. I hope you understand me because I just see the screen and not whether my micro is on. What I present is joint work with a number of colleagues from the Sure Farm project, particularly Franziska Appel, Jo Beitebier, Isabeau Koopmans, Christine Pitzen, Julie Urquhart, Mauro Vigani, and Erwin Wouters. What are the demographic challenges? This is a big topic, also as a justification for the next reform of the European Common Agricultural Policy. One background is surely that the baby boomer generation, to which I belong, will retire within the next 10 to 15 years.
Alphonse, we don't see your slides yet.
This is strange.
Maybe try again to share your screen and choose.
Yeah, I will try again. I will stop sharing the screen and I will.
Alphonse, if you want, I can share my screen with your presentation, and I move the slides as you tell me.
Do you see now my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, let us try it this way. Okay, so as I said already, the baby boomer generation will retire. Next point is that the cohorts of the generations Y and Z, which have recently entered the job market or are entering it in soon time, are much smaller in size. And that means even many family farms may not have a potential successor because of non-existing children or children which are not interested in agriculture at all. But it means also that there is an increasing scarcity of qualified labor to hire. And that means, for example, agriculture has to expect increasing wages. Another issue is, and that is eventually also very important with regard to the demographic challenges, that many rural areas experience ongoing outmigration and aging, and this affects particularly poorer regions, and that often goes along with deteriorating infrastructures which do not necessarily benefit the attractiveness of these regions for young people. On the other hand, richer rural areas may benefit from this process by attracting migrant workers. On the other side, there's also the agricultural sector where many farms are still not profitable and many farms are not operating at the state of art with regard to technologies. And there's also very fierce competition among farms, particularly for land. And the question is, what does that mean? And we have studied two questions for two study regions. The first question is there really a problem if farms do not have a successor, not necessarily on the farm level, but on the regional agriculture level? And the second issue is, are young farmer payments really a useful policy instrument to cope with this potential lack of successors? We have two study regions, one in Germany, which is the Altmark, in the eastern part of Germany with large farms, often much larger than 250, sometimes 1,000 hectares, where we find family and corporate farms. We have mainly an agricultural sector relying on hired labor, focusing on arable and livestock farming. And on the other hand, the second study region is Flanders in the northern part of Belgium with rather small and medium farms, family-based, mainly family labor, only little share of hired labor, on strong importance of livestock production. You see already at the pictures that field sizes are very different. We have used two methodologies. One is based on participative approaches where we had focus groups and stakeholder workshops. And on the other hand, we used computer simulations, which are agent-based models, which allowed endogenous structural change where farms compete for land, but where the farms may decide on exit or where farms may have no successor and exit because of a lack in a successor. We have simulated several scenarios for both regions. One scenario, 100%, where every farm has a potential successor who can decide, but we also studied scenarios where only 50% of the farms have a potential successors, or even just 25% of the farm. And then we studied what does it mean with regard to farm exits, for example. And here we simulated 20 years to the future until 2036. And we found, for example, indeed, if there is no successor, quite a number of farms exit. But if we look at the share of farms which exit due to the lack of a successor, then we find for the Altmark in Eastern Germany that indeed this is an important driver. While if there is always a successor available, farms mainly disappear because of lacking profitability. If we look at Flanders, the interesting phenomenon is that the main reason why farms exit during the process of generational change is, even if many farms do not have a successor, that the farms are not profitable. That means farm exit may, on the other hand, allow other farms to grow. And that is also an outcome of our simulations, where the exit of some farms allows other farms to grow and to exploit economies of scale. If we look at the income which is generated by the agricultural sector, we find hardly any effect of a lack in successors. The surviving farms take over the land and produce, and in some cases, such as for Flanders, we find that less farms produce even more and generate more sectoral income. We also studied the impacts of the young farmer payments, where we studied 3 scenarios, one without young farmers payments, one with the current level, and one based on CEJA proposals, which say, let us consider a doubling of direct payments. Again, we looked at the 2 regions, Flanders and the Altmark. I will not go into figures. We found hardly any effects. The effects on structural change are hardly negligible. Only very few additional farms survived. Effects on land use are negligible. Total factor income is negligible. Partly we find higher rental prices in the longer run, which is to the benefit of landowners, but not to the benefit of the farmers. And with regard to employment, we also found no significant effects. These findings were confirmed by stakeholder workshops with farmers and experts from our study regions. So the general conclusion was that these young farmer payments are rather a waste of money. Some people take the money and benefit from it, but it has no long-lasting impact on the agricultural sector. Let me now come to the policy recommendations and conclusions with regard to generational renewal, which we particularly also derived from the stakeholder workshops. There is a strong demand for more educational support, and not only support with regard to production and improving production and technology, but also regarding the management of complex farms and better management of the increasing bureaucratic burdens, for example, of farms. A second issue is there is a need for investments in the attractiveness of rural areas. That means particularly infrastructures for young families and particularly also infrastructures for migrant workers, which are more and more needed given the demographic change, particularly in Western Europe. Then there is a demand for policies which support alternative business models. The current policies, this impression of the stakeholders are rather deterring innovations and deterring also innovative concepts like, for example, shared or cooperative farmings or regarding new products and production systems. And there is a strong demand, particularly by the young generation of farmers, for more clear and consistent policies. Currently, many regulations which are set up send mixed messages, not only with regard to EU policies, but also there are lots of regulations which differ on the regional level from let's say the EU level, but there's also not strong trust in a long-lasting strategy of the policy. Okay, here I come to the end and just advertise again our policy briefs, but there's also more extensive business briefs, which argues, for example, that there's a need to refocus eventually from to look more at more successful generational renewals than just looking at numbers. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Alphonse, for keeping the time and for synthesizing your messages also as effectively as before. You can withdraw your screen that we're seeing at the moment, Alphonse. Thank you very much. And now,
yeah, I hope I do not find the button.
Floor to Professor Peter Freund, who is a professor at Humboldt-Universität zu Berlin and also a researcher in Sure Farm project. Peter will talk about a critical analysis of how current policies constrain or enable resilient EU agriculture. And he's going to have another 10 more minutes. So Peter, the floor is yours, please.
Great. Thank you very much, Alberto, and thanks to the organizers for this seminar. I hope you can see my presentation and you can hear me.
Yes.
Fantastic. So let's crack on. So first of all, what is important is that public policies are actually essential for the resilience of Europe's farming systems. Public policies can moderate or reinforce pressure on these systems to change, for example, through lax or tight regulations, by closing down or opening up policy networks, or by influencing public and professional debates. But public policies can also enhance or constrain the capability of farming systems to deal with challenges by strengthening either the robustness of the systems, that is their capacity to quickly respond to shocks and stresses, or the adaptability of farming systems, which is the ability to make minor changes in order to maintain functions. Or transformability is the ability of a farming system to completely change its mode of operation or even its identity in response to major shocks and stresses. In order to assess this, we have developed a resilience assessment tool to assess to what degree public policies support these three resilience capacities. And we have three indicators for each of the three resilience capacities. So robustness-oriented policies are characterized by a short-term focus, by a priority for protecting the status quo, by providing buffer resources, and by support for risk management, which then enables systems to bounce back after a shock. Adaptability-oriented policies have more of a midterm focus, 3 to 5 years. They are characterized by a high degree of flexibility in response to differing circumstances. They use a variety of different instruments, and they foster social learning so that farmers, for example, get in contact with other social groups in rural areas or beyond. And finally, transformability supporting policies have a long-term focus. They include that they dismantle incentives to maintain the status quo. They encourage in-depth learning. That is a kind of learning where people really question the underlying assumptions and identities of their activities. And these policies foster niche innovations which could replace a status quo activity that might become problematic. So the CAP contains a number of instruments that indeed support these different types of resilience capacities. The following instruments support the robustness of farming systems, mostly by providing buffer resources and thereby helping to maintain the status quo. First of all, the area-based direct payments, including the greening payments, then of course the market safety net and the crisis reserve, support for insurance schemes, but also the coordination of production and geographical indicators. Policies, mostly in the second pillar, support the adaptability of farming systems, in particular agro-environmental and climate measures, investment support, LEADER and LEADER Plus, but also the flexibility in some of the CAP programs, for example, modulation, and also the regional measures, which are tailor-made for regional circumstances. Now, importantly, many of these other measures constrain transformability. Transformability is often implied in policy goals, but not very specifically articulated. So the only instruments that we could actually find that support transformability are support for organic agriculture and for new rural value chains and the EAAE programs. So the overall picture then of the CAP is that the current CAP is too focused on robustness and also with uneven success, and it's constraining transformability. Why is this the case? Most financial resources go into payments that provide buffer resources, in particular the area-based direct payments. And systems that operate on small scale or which are less land intensive have little access to these buffer resources. In many countries, there are government-supported risk management schemes, but they struggle with effectiveness and with acceptance among the target groups. And then there are these undesirable effects of robustness-enabling policies. They provide disincentives to adapt or to transform in response to new challenges. In the long run, in some cases, we have observed even the unlearning of adaptability or transformability, and in some cases, these policies provide a wrong illusion of stability. Furthermore, much fewer resources are devoted to programs that enhance adaptability than those that provide buffer resources, and support for transformability is generally underdeveloped. And the result are the following pictures here. So these are the colors in our resilience assessment wheel. This is a typical example for an arable farming system. So you see there's a lot of support here for robustness, in particular through the area-based direct payments that provide buffer resources. And there's limited resource for adaptability, usually through Pillar 2 programs, and very little support for transformability. It's a different picture, for example, for a perennial system like the hazelnut production system in Lazio. Here, very little support for the status quo, but various policies that help the farming system to adapt to new challenges, in particular climate change. And a third example here is an egg and broiler production system in Sweden. And here the intended policy is indeed to dismantle the status quo and to move the entire system to more sustainability and more animal welfare. And that's partly supported by some adaptability policies. However, the dominant picture is this one. Yeah? So much support for robustness and very little support or even constraining effects on the other resilience capacities. So how could the CAP enable resilience better? There are two starting points from our observations. First, we need to meet the need for more tailored policy mixes that address the specific resilience needs of Europe's farming systems, and these needs differ widely. And the second starting point is that we need to develop a long-term vision for the CAP. Now, how could we enable robustness? We could enhance the ability and the willingness of actors to anticipate stresses and shocks and to cope with them and to respond. And this could be improved by conducting foresight exercises and link them into strategy development and outreach and engagement schemes at all levels. In order to enhance adaptability, we need a coherent and sufficient remuneration of public goods. We also need to increase the flexibility and variability of the policy through reducing red tape along 3 dimensions. First of all, the requirements for access to policy schemes, in particular in Pillar 2 programs, then more flexible or better aligned regulations and inspections, and finally, a more integrated approach to the multitude of monitoring and control systems, public and private. And finally, we need to close the gap between reflection and innovation and practice. So we need more support for project-type funding rather than predefined measures. We need more support for the agricultural knowledge and innovation systems and for advisory services that help to integrate advice for production and the provision of public goods. We also need more support for collaboration, for opening up and reconnecting agriculture with society. And finally, we should foster farmers' adaptive capacity, for example, by paying farmers for time spent in research projects. And how could we enhance transformability? We need to formulate a coordinated long-term vision. We need more support for deep learning. And we need to adopt more reflexive modes of governing that influence people's assumptions about the future, about their self-perceptions and identities. And this requires dialogue, co-design, and communication of role models and positive examples. We could also try to develop EAAE and LEADER into more cross-sectoral support for rural cooperation, and the programs for rural cooperation should adopt more integrated approaches across sectors. We should change the rules of state aid to allow more flexibility and innovation. We need to provide funding for the creation, facilitation, and integration of multi-actor networks beyond farming, including farming, but also other actors. We need to develop training schemes for facilitators of integrative rural development, And we should encourage links to other policy areas to enhance connections. Some of this is already part of some rural development programs, but it needs a further boost. So my final 2 slides, what are now our key points, our key recommendations for the future CAP, which is currently negotiated. First of all, everything points to the need to reduce direct payments with a view to phasing them out by 2028, and then to divert the budget into those CAP measures that specifically address resilience needs. The second point is we should use the eco schemes to foster public services like biodiversity and attractive landscapes and adaptation to environmental and climate change. So we suggest a points-based system where farmers get a list of possible measures from which they can select those that are most suitable for their specific farm. And this system should also enable regional differentiation, flexibility and diversity so that the measures really match the regional adaptation needs. We should enable an equivalence of established certification schemes and then define 3 or 4 tiers of payment levels, which are aligned with either public or private certification schemes of corresponding levels of ambition to reduce red tape and multiplication of control schemes. And finally, we should ensure that member states' national strategic plans really support adaptability, adaptability to meet the ambitions which have now been articulated in the Green Deal, the Farm to Fork strategy, and the biodiversity strategy. And finally, we should ensure that member states provide ample support for cooperation and cross-sectoral networking in rural development programs. Member states and also the CAP should enable producer organizations to coordinate adaptation in response to shifting markets and changing environments. We need to strengthen the agricultural knowledge and innovation systems through more project-type funding and more funding for advisory services to integrate advice for production and the provision of public goods. We should enable the transformative innovations, reflexivity and deep learning through more support for LEADER, LEADER Plus and EAAE with European networks around key challenges. As in the previous presentation, we didn't find much merit in the Young Farmers Premium, and this should be replaced with support for startups in rural areas, because this would really enable new innovative actors to start up businesses. And finally, we need to provide support for fast internet in rural areas as a precondition for the connectivity that is so important for any kind of innovation and learning. Thank you so much for your attention, and back to Alberto.
Thank you, Peter. We continue with the final presentation related to our project's findings and conclusions, and this one is going to be presented by Patrick Weitzma, who is an associate professor at Wageningen University and Research, and also researched in Sewer Farm project. Patrick will make a presentation on behalf of many other authors from our consortium partners, and the topic is resilience of farming systems in the EU under current conditions and future scenarios. So, Patrick, please take the floor to do your presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Well, Alberto already introduced this slide and the topic, so I will tell you about a policy brief on the resilience of EU farming systems under current conditions and future scenarios. So what we did in order to do that, we used the framework that has been developed in the Shore Farm project in order to do an integrated assessment. So we had to follow different steps. The first question was resilience of what? And as already explained in previous presentations, we had 11 EU farming systems as case studies. The second question is resilient to what? So what are the challenges that affect these different systems? Then we asked the questions, resilience for what purpose? So farming systems are not only about food production, but they also provide other private goods like quality of life, and they provide public goods. But to what extent they need to be provided also differs per farming system. The fourth question is, okay, what are the resilience capacities? So to what extent are these farming systems robust? to what extent can they adapt, and to what extent can they transform. But it's not always easy to investigate these capacities, and we do not always have the data to really understand. There is some other music that was not mine. So we also look at it from the other perspective, where we ask the question, okay, what enhances resilience? So what are attributes that can enhance these resilience capacities? And there's 5 principles mentioned here: diversity, openness, tightness of feedback, systems, reserves, and modularity. But within our project, we also specified this further into a range of resilience attributes. Well, in order to do this assessment, we used qualitative methods like workshops and interviews, which provide a holistic picture, but we complemented that with quantitative methods, which could provide more quantitative information on specific challenges, functions, and capacities, including system dynamics modeling, ecosystem services assessments, and also farm structural change modeling, as already presented before. So I cannot summarize everything that we did to do this, but I want to highlight the most important messages. And the first message is accumulating challenges cause farming systems to approach critical thresholds. So what we observed is that many farming systems are perceived to be close to critical thresholds. We see that low economic viability leads to farmer exits, making it hard to maintain the social fabric, natural resources, and biodiversity. And this is also shown in this figure, where we see the link between challenges in the environmental domain affecting economic viability, and that then affects also the social and environmental domain. And one example of this specifically is the extensive sheep production system in Huesca, Spain, where we really see a decline of the system. Most other farming systems are not declining yet, but also are perceived to be close to critical thresholds, and it could go wrong in the future, you could say. One thing to mention here also from the policy perspective is that also in many of these farming systems, the continuous change of laws and regulations is perceived to be critical in 5 out of 11 farming systems, indicating that is also really perceived as a challenge, and that doesn't help the resilience of these farming systems. A second main conclusion is that past strategies mainly focused on remaining economically viable, and that's partly related to the fact that it's often perceived to be close to critical threshold. So there is a focus needed on that, but that leads to a decline in the provision of public goods. This figure is a bit complex maybe for now, but what you see is 8 different functions, both in the private and the public domain, shown for all the 11 farming systems. And we see, first of all, the perception about the importance of these different functions. And we see that the size of the bubbles in all the case studies is large with regard to economic viability. This is a combination from the perspective of different stakeholders, but specifically for farmers, economic viability was very important. All stakeholders consider food production to be important, obviously you could say. And also natural resources was considered to maintain natural resources. The size of the bubbles is quite large, indicating that this is considered to be important, and generally more attention is focused on these functions. In terms of performance, you see it both on the Y and the X axis. A 5 is high and a 1 is low. We see that on average food production scores high, except from the sheep system in Spain and the horticultural system in Poland. But even though food production scores relatively high, economic viability is moderate. And so that relates also to the previous message that it's perceived to be close to critical thresholds in quite some of the farming systems. And on average, we see that the public goods score lower. You don't see the decline here because this is a static picture, but this is, a picture that at least presents this. At the same time, we still see that there's obviously a variability among farming systems on how they perceive this, and also a variability among the farming systems. Another main message is that the resilience of the farming systems is perceived as low to moderate, with robustness prevailing over transformability. When we look at the presence of the resilience attributes in these different farming systems and also the historical dynamics of the main functions, we observe that farming systems have generally been robust in the past, even though they are close to critical thresholds. But there's often also trade-offs with transformability. And that also relates to the previous presentation by Peter, where in order to keep a system robust, there are limitations to transform into desired directions. Adaptability is mostly employed for keeping stability and realizing slow incremental improvements, but not towards transformability. But as I also just mentioned in the previous slide, as public goods are declining, adaptation or even transformation is necessary. However, the strategies from the past are not sufficient to bring the desired social, economic, and environmental change. So the past strategies mainly kept farming systems robust, but adaptation and transformation are required. These strategies have led to the erosion of the social fabric and reduced the maintenance of natural resources and biodiversity. And also important is they have limits to success. So most important strategies in the past actually to keep the system robust were to increase farm size, to increase intensity, but farm enlargement is limited. At some stage, we have one global farm, and I don't think that's the direction we want to go, but it has been successful in the past, but there is a limitation to it. At the same time, yields are close to exploitable yields in quite a lot of the farming systems in Europe, and also there's a limit to success, so we need to search for other strategies. Well, sustainability and resilience can be improved when strategies do not only focus on, keeping systems economically viable, but when they try to improve multiple functions and attributes at once. And what we see in this figure is that we asked stakeholders about strategies that they implemented for current systems in order to cope with the challenges they have faced until now. And what we see in the green color is that most of these strategies mainly focused on remaining reasonably profitable. There was also attention for for strategies that strengthened other attributes like building human capital, socially self-organized, infrastructure for innovation, but nevertheless, these were much less strengthened than reasonably profitable. When we discuss strategies that are required to reach more sustainable and resilient future systems, then there was much more attention for coupling with local and natural capital, both in the production side and the legislation side. So we need to move from strategies that mainly enhance reasonably profitable to coupled with local and natural capital. You see in this figure a lot of different resilience attributes that we generally consider important for resilience. And what our assessments show that what we need to do is to strengthen ecological processes to reach these future systems. Stakeholder collaboration needs to improve. Also, the institutional environment needs to be improved, which also relates to previous presentations. But even though all of this is needed, and I think many people are aware of this, it's also needed to ensure to remain economically viable and the reasonably profitable attribute. Because if systems are not economically resilient, they can also not become resilient in the environmental and social domain. So my last main message, I think they all come together into this, is that policy should be based on a long-term vision, which should ensure economic viability of farming systems. So the economic viability is the basis, but at the same time, they need to ensure the provision of public goods, which are declining at the moment, and a change needs to be made in order to improve those. But farmers cannot do it alone. All involved actors inside and outside the farming system need to collaborate in order to make a change toward business models that tackle these long-term challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Again, thank you very much for keeping the time. And now we will move on with the agenda with two invited presentations with Tassos Haniotis and Marion Picot, whom we really thank for being available and for willing to participate in this seminar and offer us their views and their organization views. So without further delays, we will give the floor first to Tassos Aniotis, who is a director of DG Agriculture at the European Commission. And he's going to talk about DG Agri's view about policy recommendations to enhance resilience of farming systems and making a reflection on how will CAP 2020 promote farmers' resilience. So thank you very much, please, for being with us this afternoon, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alberto. I'm glad to be among ag economists. I hope you still consider me an ag economist, despite being where I am right now. I hope you're also listening to me.
We hear
fine.
you, and we consider you an agriculture economist.
Good. So I can keep going. Now, let me clarify a couple of things, because the first thing that I would like to clarify, yes, I am in DG-Agri too many years. If you ask me, and if you ask the calendar, but I would like to speak more freely on some of these issues. Obviously, I will reflect very much our thinking, which I fully support, but I will also give sometimes a different angle on some of these things. Now, first of all, I think there is a very important distinction between what is an academic, some would like to call it a technical approach, and what is a political, more a politics type of approach. And in between this lies policy. And that's why I find very important that you put the title policy briefs in what you have prepared, and you try to summarize the results of your analysis there. Now, one of the issues that I have noticed when I was reading these policy briefs is that policy is more about objectives and the degree to which we achieve or fail to achieve these than it is about definitions. I'm not saying that definitions are not important. And I'm not saying that, especially in the academic environment, you don't need to start defining certain things to be able to test certain assumptions and arrive at something. But at the end of the day, when we have to make policy proposals, and this is where when we work in DG-Agri, we might come from a different point than when some of us would be working in academia, is that we have to have an approach whose starting point is different. Because the issue of what exactly we need to achieve and whether we failed or succeeded in that is a time-specific question. And sometimes we have the tendency to judge ex post what has happened, forgetting the different starting point and the different conditions where something happens. This, by the way, explains very well what has come out in your assessment and what has come out and what's the starting point actually of our impact assessment. The fact that on the economic front, the CAP has done much better in the past than it has done in the environmental front. And this is not something relevant to the Common Agricultural Policy, it's relevant to all human activities. After the 1960s and 70s, where all the economic growth has came at a pretty significant cost to the environment. And if we go a little bit back also, it has come at a cost that has translated in the problems that we face with climate change. So what was the driver on what worked and what didn't work in our analysis, and why? There are a couple of useful reminders here. The first one is that we did an impact assessment where we did not propose a preferred option, but we chose, if you want, a different definition, the one that was more constraining to us on the basis of our starting point, which is a definition of sustainability. And we looked at the three different dimensions of sustainability: an economic, the environmental, and the social one. And we did three options. We analyzed three options that were stretching each one of these angles. One was very economic, no subsidization type of policy. The other, very environmental. The third had the social impact of redistributing support. But we ended up without a preferred option. And we ended up also with 4 workshops organized. One of them was, the first one was actually antimicrobial resistance, which shows the reflection of consumer-driven, citizen-driven, if you want, concerns, and the link to other policies. We did one on the voluntary versus mandatory aspects of agro-environmental measures, one of the role of the CAP on jobs and labor, the World Bank study was part of it, and also some of you participated in it. And the other one was also on risk management. And we also started the farm to fork preparation, which started with the previous commission. And in fact, there is a presentation I made at the European University Institute in September of 2019 that identifies what we see strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats in all the 3 layers of the farm to fork, at the farm side, at the fork side, and the trade between what is produced and what is consumed. And this is why when the Green Deal came about, there was already a relevance to the Green Deal. It didn't cover everything, it didn't cover quantitative targets, but it covered the overall orientation. And here is their additional element, the recommendations to the strategic plans, to whose importance I will come later on. Now, in our discussion, we all agree on one thing, that one size does not fit all. But we also need to be very clear about what we don't agree. We don't agree which is the size that fits what. And this is still debatable. And it is debatable, and this is where your research and other research projects also provide some useful indications. What I would like to do is identify some pertinent questions, and then I will come up with a couple of points that I personally consider extremely important. But the pertinent questions that we see in the discussions we're having right now is this shift from compliance to performance, how we're going to achieve at it. The debate we are having with the member states was a very typical example. It was one of these debates in the Special Committee of Agriculture this Monday. These are closed meetings, but nothing is closed in these days, and everybody knows that there is a letter of several member states claiming that the indicators and the data we're asking are actually additional data, and they provide administrative burden. We're talking about data that already exists, that exists in disaggregated form at the member states, and we're talking about a different way of sharing this data. And we're talking about it in 2021, where with a digital transition, we know that we all have to change our informatic systems, since we know that there are very solid ways of using more information in a more efficient and targeted way. So how exactly we measure performance should be at the core of what we're doing. And here, the next question that comes is, how much flexibility should we give to the member states, and what is the role of strategic plans? I liked when Peter said that we have to ensure that member states' national strategic plans provide sufficient support and the rest. Yes, that's our role actually, to ensure that. And we have actually worked pretty well together at the preparatory stage with member states on their SWOT analysis. And there aren't main differences in the SWOT analysis. Where the problem lies, of course, is how are we going to guarantee an additional level of ambition in all member states, especially when the starting point is different. And this is why transparency in this process becomes essential. And this is why focusing on the targets that have to be met, which are targets that are not binding and they are at the EU level, requires information at the member state level that is extremely important to be able to grasp what is the real increase in the level of ambition that has to apply on all land, and not only on some land that has a certain preference compared to other. One other element that for us is very important is the interdependence of the objectives we have defined. These are 9 objectives split equally between economic, environmental, and social. But the important thing is what? It's more than 20 years ago now that OECD coined this term jointness, which we focus all in the jointness in the delivery of the private and the public good. And here is where, with some of you as an ag economist, you know that I have a different approach. We do consider that the role of direct payments is extremely important, and they cannot actually be phased out by 2028. Personally, I believe that you also know that. And the transition away of the direct payments, if it happens like that, will take more time. What is extremely important and what we need to do with direct payments is clearly target them in a much better way. And here comes the crucial question. I mean, do we still need to have payments that are based on land, but target land on different characteristics, more regionalized, more on the basis of the quality of land, more taking into account a very different land market situation, land price situation in different member states, or not? Land is one of the three crucial factors of production. I don't think anybody wants to give payments on the basis of capital. And when it comes to labor, we will need an army to be able to grasp what is happening and make sure that there is no massive fraud in the implementation of the policy. So if we still consider to base payments on land, and I think most of the agro-environmental and second pillar type or eco schemes are going to be based on land, the real question mark is what exactly is going to be the determining factor on the basis of which we will determine these payments. And one suggestion is this type of point system. But from what I notice in this point system, it's still of a qualitative nature. And the big question mark is who's going to do that? Because don't forget, we need to be able to judge the level of ambition at EU level also, and not only at the member state level. And here we do have some pretty serious dilemmas. I'm not saying that this is not a promising way. It is a promising way, but we need to add some hard numbers, and a lot of the already ongoing research helps in this direction, but it doesn't help in all member states in the same way. And that's important to keep in mind in the political discussions we're having. Now, there is all this issue on whether CAP reforms are about the transformability of the policy. I mean, if you look at EU agriculture today and EU agriculture 20 or 30 years ago, it's black and white, the difference, whether it's in the trade position, in production patterns, or even in emissions. I mean, whatever one needs to do in reducing further emissions, and we need to do a lot to reduce further emissions. Are there any lessons to be learned from the fact that from all the major agricultures in the world, only the European agriculture reduces emissions? And don't tell me that this is due to the collapse of the Central and Eastern Europe, because half of it is due to this collapse. The rest, something must have worked but in the de-intensification of production methods and in using some best practices on the ground that provide some useful indications about where to go from the future. What I mean with that is we should not introduce a new false dilemma. We have this first and second pillar as if instead of being complementary, they are substitutes to each other. We should not introduce a new false dilemma, robustness versus transformability and resilience. We need all three, maybe with a different balance between the payments that help one or the other, but we need all three elements. And now, because I think I'm coming close to my points, three things on, because I'm speaking to an academic it's on the role of knowledge. And these are very personal points. First of all, I consider extremely important and useful that soil mission is DG-Agri's proposal in the next research program of the European Union. Because if you do good things in soil, you automatically do things for water, for air, and for biodiversity. And the role of the innovation partnerships is extremely important, but what is very important in the EPs is that these groups talk to each other across member states and with similar experience. And this is something that we need to work and improve. Second, I would like to stress the focus we have on turning FADN into the Farm Sustainability Data Network. This is not just an issue of adding some agro-environmental indicators pertinent to Green Deal targets to the FADN. It is about linking the data that is generated to the farm advisory systems and providing also feedback to farmers that tells them how to best improve their practices and share this information with others. And to do that, of course, the voluntary nature of SDN needs to be retained. And finally, and that is very personal, and that's the lesson from COVID and its relevance. First of all, in terms of vaccines, what do vaccines tell us about the importance of new genome editing techniques, and are they relevant also for the agricultural sector? Is human health something very different in terms of the technologies we apply than animal or plant health? And the second issue, which is also to me extremely important in this debate, we're not alone. In fact, we are a small minority in a global challenge. And the question on whether we need to produce more with less is asked in a very different way at the European level, and is asked in a very different way if we ask it at the global level. And I believe that Europe has a lot to offer in this global debate if we keep this extremely important issue into our mind. With that, I stop here. I hope I didn't overdo it, and I'll be glad if there are any questions to answer to them at the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tassos. You were very clear in your messages, and of course, you should feel comfortable within this community of environmental, agricultural economists. So, thank you very much for your presentation. And now we come to the final presentation, who is going to be presented by Marion Picot, who is a policy advisor at the European Council of Young Farmers. Marion, again, thank you very much for being with us this afternoon, and we'll be impatient to hear what you want to tell us. Thanks. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the invitation. I am Marion Picot, the policy advisor at the European Council of Young Farmers, CEJA. CEJA is actually the EU umbrella organization that represents young farmers across Europe, in several EU member states, and also in the United Kingdom and Serbia. Before I start going more in details of what is our conception of resilience from the farmers, I would like to give a bit of insight on the part of generational renewal. I have read with great interest the policy brief you have provided, and we have to say that we agree with the needs assessments, and I would like to precise a bit why we believe that generational renewal needs to be considered when we talk. First of all, a key aspect of it is that it is not about supporting generational renewal just for that sake. It is really about having more positive externality to it, where it is dynamic landscapes, rural territories with more vibrancy, environmental and climate action, or even the uptake of innovation in the long run. Where we agree with your assessment is, first of all, that we need a coherent territorial system. The CAP is indeed important for young farmers, but something that is even more important is the have a coherent framework that mixes national policies, regional and local policies. That's a core element. The second element is that we need, when we discuss of policy in that field, we need to embrace the evolving nature of farming and young farmers' aspirations. It was said already a few times in early speaking points that young people's aspirations are different in the sense that today in CEJA, we are representing millennials, let's say, in terms of generation. Tomorrow, there will be the generation Z as well. And it is also important to see that their aspiration in terms of work-life balance, for example, may be a bit more, let's say, significant. And in a way, when we are discussing of agricultural policy and the possibility to have young farmers being attracted to it, we need to discuss areas in general and their development. That is a very important part. The third element is that it's not about young farmers generational renewal. It's about intergenerational links and the capacity to channel what the expertise of all the farmers is today, and empowering new generations at the same time to access new opportunities. I will get back to that point later. And last but not least, I think that it is very important when we discuss of the CAP to make a clear statement here that for young farmers, the most useful instruments in their eyes are those on the sector. So startup ads, investment support, cooperation measures, knowledge and education, risk management instruments. And this is in echo to the comment on young farmer premiums earlier on. It's very important to say that in the next CAP, the reason why CEJA has been so vocal on the pillar budget is because the share of the budget can be transferred to installation ads under the second pillar. So that's why we have been so vocal on the facts of increasing that budget, because we see it as an opportunity for the countries which don't have installation aid today. If you take Ireland, Denmark, the Netherlands, it gives an opportunity to young farmers to push for that installation measure to be implemented. I would like now to go a bit more in depth into the definition of resilience and the 3 chapters that you have outlined. First of all, it is true that the robustness of the farming sector may be the aspect that is most pushed forward. Nevertheless, from the farmer perspective, also from the young farmer perspective, it is far from being achieved. So if we take the example of risk management and insurance, some key difficulties to overcome are, for example, the key that farmers can have to maintain savings for buffer. Your findings say that savings are the first element of on-farm resilience. And the reality today is that for many farmers, and especially young farmers, in the first years of their activity, there is no saving. There is also, and that is also on the responsibility of the sector that I represent today, there's also a lack of trust and a lack of knowledge on risk management and insurances. And that leads to situations in which they are not going for the information, or they don't have the information accessible. So in terms of pathways for action, first of all, it's very important to have business plans in which there's a clear risk assessment. The pooling of resources, for example, into mutualization funds in the as well. There's also the need for a clear public-private framework on risk management instruments. It is true that member states find the current framework not feasible. So in the future, we would like to see that framework improve. And everything related also to co-creation processes, for example, to it be a useful pathway as well. And last but not least, education, training programs, advisory services, they have to integrate further risk management strategy. On the aspect of robustness that is more about support the ability to invest and also to build multifunctional farming, because we discuss a lot about multifunctional farming, but we don't necessarily see concretely what that may imply on the farm. So in terms of challenges, we have first, as you have all said, a very capital intensive sector, but a difficulty to access credit. And that is very true for young farmers, who are 2 to 3 times more likely to see their loan application rejected. That is something to really take into account on the front end of investment. There's also a very strong willingness to invest. So young farmers, for example, are willing to switch towards organic farming, they are willing to invest into agritourism, to multifunctional strategies. But the problem is that their capacity to invest is very limited in the first. And this is a crucial time, nevertheless, to push for the viability of their farm. This week, we had a discussion with a Spanish young farmer, with an organic farmer who moved from Madrid to install herself with her partner on a farm. And she was telling us that although she manages to pay bills, for now, she doesn't have the capacity to invest in the farm. That is a everyday problem. In terms of pathway for action, again, financial instruments are a very important feature. It can be guarantee, it can be risk-sharing loans, it can also be green bonds. Those are very where we looked at instruments by young farmers. We would also like to look at measures to prevent the capitalization of the land. So the land planning at local level is very crucial for this, but also maybe to have a bigger reflection on direct payments. And also looking at market measures and at policy measures that can remunerate the production. So that is what we will try to look at in the development and implementation of eco schemes. But we are also looking at other tools such as urban farming. On adaptability, a few thoughts. So first of all, I think we were all tested in our adaptability during the COVID-19 pandemic. In the last year, we had the closure of HoReCa channels that forced farmers to find alternative marketing channels. There was cancellations in the agriculture, which required a lot of liquidity to fix, and also a crucial lack of workforce in the fields and along the field. There are 3 comments I would like to make. The first one is we need to invest into education and lifelong learning. Adaptability is a key skill. It's a soft skill, and this is a skill that should be integrated in farming education. We need to enlarge the scope of farming education with public goods, climate adaptation, mitigation, but also entrepreneurship. Today, you have still many farmers, many young farmers, who have a lot of difficulty to establish a business. It is also about improving the availability of training, both for farmers and farm workers, because there's a need for skilled workers, and also on the front of advising, a continuous professional development for farm advisors. 2 other pathways for action may be to provide adequate infrastructure. We have seen how much high quality broadband was important during that COVID-19 crisis. Many farmers were willing to facilitate the direct selling through online tools, but could not access. And last but not least, boosting collective capacity is essential here too, because adaptability can also be done as a collective. Farmers' cooperation is very important. It would maybe require more flexibility in terms of competition rules. And we need in the adaptability strategy to integrate as well. Last but not least, I would like to discuss a bit of the transformability and introduce you to 2 young farmers that are part of DG. Diana, first, she's an Italian wine grower. She produces Chianti wine, and she has transitioned in organic farming. She is taking care of quite a big domain with producing her own wine, but also producing some flour for pasta. And she has invested into direct selling. She has invested into getting closer to the consumers. And one of the core things she would need for transformability is to help her to promote her production. And on the other hand, you have Willem, a young farmer from the south of the Netherlands. And Willem has a very interesting transformability story, I believe. His farm used to be dairy cows. His parents were dairy producers. And when he installed himself, he was 18 years old. And he decided that because it is more out of his interest, he decided to produce arable crops instead. The result of that transformation of that farm is that from next year on, he will be investing in producing his own soybean milk. So instead of selling his soybeans, he will process them into milk. And the reason why I wanted to introduce you to those 2 young farmers is because they have ensured the development of a few reflections on the question of transformability. There are several factors we can look at for this. I believe that the age factor is an important one because young farmers are required to make significant investments. And it is not the case when you have farmers that are about to retire. So whether it is on a family farm, the succession process or not, there is something to really invest in here with young farmers and empowering them to transform those farming systems. The second aspect that was also in the policy brief is the intergenerational factor. Often there is a tension because there's the willingness for the young ones to follow their own interests and projects, but there's also on the other side a peer or family pressure where it is about continuing the tradition of the farm. The anticipation factor is an important one because predictability is key to transformability. If some of the trends that we are living through are obvious, if we take climate change, it is obvious that young farmers will need and farmers will need to include those as their business. But you also have other mega trends that might require more information and research. And also, it is about anticipation is also about the readiness to face the potential risks that may come up with the transformability. The last element is the knowledge. So once again, I have the feeling that this presentation has been all about knowledge and education. It is key and we won't repeat it enough. We need strong entrepreneurship skills if we want to transform the farming system. And it starts with the capacity to assess the feasibility of it. And I believe that giving those competencies to young farmers of today is ensuring that transformation will be as successful as possible. So I just wanted to have those few thoughts with you and to share them with you. And I stay available for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Marion. It was also very clear and enlightening messages from your organization. I will give the floor to Miranda McWilson, who is going to close this seminar, handling some of the questions and perhaps giving the last messages. So Miranda, if you are kind enough to lead the final section of the seminar, I'll give the floor to you.
Okay, that's indeed, we plan to finish in time, so that's just a little bit of time left. I asked the question to Tassos, so now I have the floor. I just take the opportunity to ask the question. Tassos, I just wrote it in the chat. Happy to read it out. So with putting the focus on sustainability a lot, that seems to be seen as a golden solution for many challenges. But I would argue that it needs to go hand in hand with the purpose of looking for more resilience. How do you see this?
Well, I see the need to come up to practical solutions where I'm sitting from, and I'm not going to be sitting where I'm sitting for too long because I'm getting older and next year I need to retire. But whatever I do, maybe in the future we'll have more time to ask these questions. But whether we like it or not, for years now we have been focusing on sustainability aspects, and we have developed a series of notions around them. Resilience is not something that we don't think about. In the foresight exercise that the Commission is doing, this is one of the elements. There's going to be even a resilience dashboard developed. But what I see is a multiplication of indicators and concepts. And when it comes to the practical point, whether the practical point means discussing in the Council and the Parliament, which will have to take the decisions, or discussing to the farmers, the questions we get is, what does this imply for me? And that's where I think whatever concepts and elements we have, we need to move from having parallel monologues into a convergence into some specific priorities that we will agree in. And then whatever name we give it, fine, we could have a dictionary that translates one into the other.
Yes, that's also an advice to us that we make very concrete. What does it imply? What does it imply for farmers, but also for the other actors that we looked at in the chain, for instance, and the other actors around the farmer? So that is a good advice for us to do that in this final stage of this resilience project. We also got a question from Nathan. I think that is also still time to do that. Alphonse and your team, it's a question to you. So Nathan wonders whether, to stimulate generational renewal, do you think, who should take the lead here? Who should do what? and are governments equipped enough to do that, for instance?
Okay, let me start with the second question, which was asked by Nathan. How to establish, for example, education with regard to complex farming problems. And what means complex? Complex doesn't just mean that you may have larger farms, but that you have new challenges. And if you look, for example, at the points raised just by Marion, there is an increasing capital intensity, and that means that farmers need to develop their management skills with regard to finance and investments, because they manage huge amounts of money, and that does not just mean to be able to insure, but also, for example, to have a perception of upcoming problems, which may eventually mean that you can no longer use your stable, which you originally planned to use for 20 years. What means it if, for example, consumption of pork will decline by 50, 60% in the next decades, if, for example, climate change requires new consumption patterns. Or another issue is soft skills, for example, with regard to how to manage conflicts with employees or within the family. And these are trainings which can be organized on the local level. The question, however, is who takes the lead. And one option is that, for example, in the second pillar, there will could new measures be established which support training activities on the regional level, and then in the end, local actors are requested. That means, for example, local public institutions, but also farmers' organizations, which could engage in new formats for young farmers, for example, to participate in lifelong learning, not just in the technological skills, but also particularly in the soft skills. And for example, one could provide also some packages or training programs or some funding where farmers get money, young farmers, if they participate in training activities.
So Nathan, do you want to ask a follow-up question here, or is it clear for you?
Yes, I think it's pretty clear. Thank you.
Okay, thank you then. Yeah, with that, I think it's time to close the webinar. Jutta, I'm not so sure whether you're still around, but thanks for offering the opportunity today. For us as a project, it comes right in time because we still have 2-3 months to finalize and to make it all concrete, what we find and what we recommend. And I see that yeah, the practical implications are very important. We also organize an EAAE seminar later on in May, and yeah, that's also on the agenda then. Thank you all for being here, and if you have questions still popping up, feel free to send me an email with these questions. Jutta, you want to say something as a closing word?
Yeah, thank you very much to the organizers and all the presenters. Very interesting presentations and discussion, and a lot of food for thought.
Okay, I wish you all a good evening, and well, let us know if you have further follow-up questions or thoughts. Thank you all, and see you in a follow-up meeting in the EAAE, for instance. Okay, have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, stay safe all.
Yeah, you too.
Bye. Bye-bye. Thank you, Miranda.